So here we are starting with Azure Virtual Networking. So here if I wanted to explain like why do we need VNet? So simple scenario like virtual network or networking basically provide you isolation first thing in place. So whenever you have any infrastructure, any services or resources to be provisioned, or even as Bhavesh also mentioned that we can get some sort of segregation. So isolation is basically segregating resources from each other and we can isolate from each other in terms of communication, in terms of security point of view. So here isolation is basically hiding your environment, whereas we can have a particular, you can consider a kind of activity where you can think of like maybe in terms of security point of view. So you can basically plan and manage, or maybe you can consider that you will be able to design and implement some sort of environment, or when you say some sort of like activity in place, then in certain scenario, what we need to play around with it, or maybe you can say what we need to identify that in case of any particular solution, what we need to think about. So isolation, security, you can say communication, you can also consider static IP, you can also consider DNS, right? So these are some of the feature we can plan and manage, and you can consider that these are some of the features probably we can identify in terms of working with like a virtual network kind of scenario when it comes to planning and providing you a kind of solution. Now extension to this, why do we need VNet? So, as you guys rightly mentioned that it is basically fulfilling the requirement of communication. So there are three different type of communication probably I can think of. So one is, so here we can think of when it comes to cloud communication. So we can think of some of the options where you may simply plan and provide a kind of, you can say mapping amongst these services, right? And it will provide you a kind of you can consider like resource communications or all of that. You may have this option available from the like different source to different source connected and access in terms of planning and working with your networking kind of option. So the first thing in place, we have a particular kind of communication in terms of starting with first scenario, and that particular scenario is something maybe we can consider it in place. So let me put this. So there are three different type of communication we can have. First is on-premise to cloud, right? So that is something we can get it in terms of on-premise to cloud. We can have cloud to cloud. So this can be a multi-cloud scenario. And last but not least, user network to cloud. So we need to identify that what sort of communication we are like looking at it, and with these particular communication you will be able to like plan and manage, and you will be able to configure your particular environment altogether, and it will basically provide you a kind of option that what sort of like access you are like looking at it, and then accordingly you may simply play around with those activity, and then it will help you out in terms of managing your security controls and constraints the way it is expected. So networking is basically providing you all these features. Now, if we are starting with networking, I'm sure definitely, I mean, we are not learning networking in that advanced level, but at least I can help you out to get started with understanding what is networking, why we do we need, and what are the things we get it. So networking always starts with CIDR. So CIDR, or people call it out as in CIDR or something like that. So CIDR stands for classless inter-domain routing, right? So that is something we can consider, that in case of planning and working with your networking, you will always start with this classless inter-domain routing. Now, this is something, this concepts basically redirect you to the IP range setup in your particular networking, which starts usually with 0.0.0/0. That means whole network range we get it in terms of planning and working with your particular networking. And based on the requirement, we will be able to customize our networking, and then accordingly it will work. So you will get maximum 256 by 256 by 256 by 256, and then you can have a multiplication available on top of it. Now there are two type of IP version available in industry, that is IPv4 and IPv6. These are the version of IPs which, like most of the enterprises and enterprises are using it for their networking scenario, for their particular services to be implemented, and uh, that will be that will be a kind of like requirement what we need to follow when it comes to planning and provisioning services, what we are like looking at it. So we can have a kind of option where you need to figure it out that what sort of scenario you are planning to go for, and then accordingly you will be able to define your IP range and network scenario in place. Now here, uh, in case of planning and creating your networking, right? As we discussed that, okay, networking is all about isolations and grouping your particular environment. So it gets started with your particular region, okay? So here I can say we can have a specific region in place, and under this particular region, we can have a particular virtual network. So I'm presenting virtual network with some dash line and all, so that way at least it will become easy to understand the difference between region and network and all that stuff. So here we can consider that if we have networking, then networking is basically providing you a kind of, so here I can consider that virtual network in a simple scenario, I can consider that virtual network cannot span across region. It will be available, it's a regional service. It is only available into the single region. It can be multiple VNet, but per region, you can have, depend on your quota and limits, you can have multiple VNets in place, but virtual network cannot span across region. So here, if I'm labeling this region as in, let's say, East US, then East US, this VNet, maybe if I give a name, let's say my app VNet. So this VNet cannot be like it cannot span from East US to West US or some other region. It will be restricted to that specific region only. So virtual network is basically regional service. It's not a global service. Of course, I mean, we do have an option if we wanted to connect this VNet to across the region, across the VNet also within the same region, across the region, or across the subscriptions and all of that. Those options are there. With those things, we can do it. But in general, while working with standalone virtual network, the single VNet, it will be a particular regional service. It will be only available within that specific region. Every virtual network has a IP range. So here if I say 10.0.0.0 slash, let's say 16. So how does 16 basically come up? So here if you consider, these are the 4 octet, right? These are the 4 octet, and 8 octet basically considered like as an 8 bit of value. So 8 fours are total 32. So here your this range is basically made up of the slash number whatever you give. So here if I say 10.0.0.0, and here if I say okay, I wanted to give 8, that means the first octet will be freezed, and you will get option to change and modify number of IP range under this particular segment. If I say this same thing 10.0.256, or here it will be 16, then that means first two octet will remain freezed, and you will get almost around if you multiply 65K plus IP range in your network. Right, so it's more about like whenever we are planning our net, and this number cannot be like in this way 8, 16 or something. It can be 29, 27, 24, 20, whatever you wanted. If you say 32, that means the whole IP range gets freezed. So usually when we go for static IP for our home network or something like that, they are like kind of dedicated IP associated to you. So there is no, it's a single IP only, for example. So in that case, if you give 32, that means this whole IP range will be the fixed IP, and you cannot change and modify any octet of this particular IP. So whatever number you put behind this slash, that number basically allows you to decide what is the breakdown of number of IPs you wanted in your network. So here I can say if I give this 10.0.0 slash 16, then I can divide my whole VNet in different subnet segments. So subnet is basically a segregation, or it's a kind of logical group which allows you to break down your whole network IP range into a smaller chunk, and you will be able to plan and deploy the services or the resources what we are like looking at it. So subnet is basically, it's a kind of conceptual layer under your virtual network, and this layer basically allows you to provision the infrastructure services underneath. So it can be like, let me put instance symbol so that it will become easy. So here we can have a variety of services to be implemented. So here you can consider that probably you can simply go ahead with your particular virtual machines, and under this particular VMs, you will be able to plan and deploy and manage your particular services altogether. So these particular subnet, probably you can provide logical name. Let's say uh, web app subnet, and it can be 10.0.0.0/24. That means I will get 256 IP under this particular first subnet. I mean, that is a different story where Microsoft keep 5 IP with them for additional settings and configuration from each this breakdown. That's something we will talk later. But in general, here it will be like you can go on, like this is something one, I can say API subnet probably. This is my like DB subnet, and this can be like 2.0 or something. So here you can have a particular logical grouping of your particular VNet and subnet, and this particular activity will allow you in terms of planning and working with your particular services, and you can decide that what sort of options, or maybe you can say what sort of activity you are planning to go for, and then you can set up your particular networking scenario the way it is expected. So ultimately, like the goal over here is that we need to identify, or maybe you can say we need to visualize that in case you wanted to plan and manage and work with your networking scenario, then this is something probably you may simply go ahead with that, and it will help you out that what sort of like networking scenarios and structure you wanted, and then accordingly you may simply work with those activity into the system what we wanted. So VNet or virtual network is basically a logical grouping of your services. By isolating them behind this VNet and subnet, you can allow deny your particular security controls, right? So we were talking about this security model. So virtual network available with the service in terms of enabling enterprises to protect their particular workloads, and based on that particular workload security, you will be able to plan and manage and create and configure your particular services the way it is expected. So ultimately, the goal over here is that to provide you a kind of option, or maybe you can say provide you a kind of activity where you can simply play around with some of the different scenario in place, and then accordingly you will be able to isolate your particular environment the way it is expected. So the purpose of this networking is to provide you a kind of isolation, uh, securing your particular network traffic. And if I add more particular components to it, then it will be a kind of you can say it will be a kind of traffic routing. It will be a kind of like environment planning and management, and many other activities will be considered as a part of it. And then according to that, so that way at least we can have a kind of isolation in place, and then accordingly you will be able to plan your resources and other things into the system. Now, here, this is like one of the very simple activity. If I try to show you in a portal, so here we can search for virtual networks. So it will be a kind of service available. So here I can say like network and click on create. So here I'll just show you the simple demo of virtual network creation, and the property which I was explaining in that slide, I will show you over here as well. So it will become easy for you to compare both the particular options, and then later stage if you wanted to give it a try, maybe also you will get I'll show you a couple of demo as well with some hands-on activity within detail. So I will share some of the links with you, which you guys can give it a try on your own as well in your free time, and that way also you will be able to explore that. So here, while creating networking, so I'll create my resource group first of all. So I will say vnet demo-rg, virtual network name. So I'll consider that my vnet. Now there is no mandatory part that you should follow this way naming convention. It's completely up to you. I mean, I have a habit of following kind of naming convention like in this style probably. If when you provide some naming conventions and all, right, so it is always there is a nice recommendation and guideline provided by Microsoft itself. So here you can consider that Azure resource naming conventions, right? So if you take a look at it, it's very nice documentation given on cloud adaptation framework point of view. So there are two things. Probably I will refer. I will come back to this particular point later stage as well. But right now, just for your high level understanding, that one of the criteria is Azure Cloud Adaptation or Microsoft Cloud Adaptation Framework. This framework is basically a kind of you can say industry standard given by Microsoft, where as I mentioned earlier as well, that most of the enterprises come and ask you that, hey, are we following best practices? Is this the best practice to follow the naming conventions and all, right? So in that case, answer is yes, it is there. And there are some of the recommended naming conventions and approaches are given that how you name to your services, right? So it's like resource type, workload or application up and running on that particular resource, whether it's a dev stage prod environment, under which region you have deployed it, and how many number of instance it is, like 0, 1, 0, 2, 0, 3, something like that. So there are different particular criteria is defined in terms of naming convention point of view, which you can follow along with it, which basically you can standardize within the organization so that people will be able to follow that, and accordingly, you will be able to provide those particular naming convention in place. This is something from the rule-based point of view, that when you provide a name, right? So how many number of characters are allowed under that naming convention? Sometimes like we use capital letters, sometimes we use small letters. Now let's say for example, if I'm working with storage account, then I cannot use capital letter in my storage account name. I can only use small letters, alphanumeric value, but all small character. Capital is not allowed. So kind of like rules and regulations are given. So with the combination of this particular readiness and with the combination of this rule of name declarations and all of that, you will get to know that what combinations probably we should follow so that you can have a better like resource name created for the services what we are like looking at it. So let me share this link with all of you. So whenever I find some links, I will like share it with all of you, so that way at least you guys can have access to it and you can keep it handy for your reference. Maybe you can bookmark it, right? So that way at least it will be accessible to all of you. So here, when we go ahead with networking part of it, so we can define this. Here we have the VNet name, the region specifically, as I said. So the way I mentioned that VNet cannot span across region. So at a time you can select only single region. You cannot say that this my VNet will be available in this two region, right? It will not be possible. So here you can have individual, I mean, single region can have multiple VNet, but that VNet cannot span across to that particular region. So this is something I'm providing it as an East US. The next option is basically the security and all. So here, what we need to do is that we need to provide a particular kind of you can say when we are going through with this particular virtual network, then here there are a couple of additional features which is associated to your VNet, right? From the security point of view. So as I mentioned that we are expecting virtual network created in terms of isolation or maybe segregating your resources, security point of view, communication point of view, IP addresses and DNS and other stuff. So here if you see the security point of view, so there are different security aspects are given. First option is virtual network encryption. Usually what is happening when you have data packets traveling from one machine to another machine, they are traveling via this particular networks only. So during that time frame, you wanted to secure your data packets, then in that particular scenario, this encryption is something you can provide. So there is no middle of the man attack will be possible. This is a term. I forgot that actual term name. I mean, this is something the full form or something. So that basically break down your particular data packets, still your data, modify the data and change and update into that case. So to avoid such situation, probably we can have some sort of encryption in place, and then accordingly you will be able to provide the specific activity in place. We have Azure Bastion. So Bastion is something, one of the alternative of RDP and SSH. So what is RDP and what is SSH? So RDP and SSH is basically a mechanism to connect with your Windows machine with RDP and Linux machine with SSH. So these are the ports, are like port numbers are offered to you in terms of connecting with the instance. So for example, the first port number is RDP, which is available in the number of 3389. That is your port number to connect with your instance. Whereas the SSH, which is something 22, is something available for your Linux instance. So these are the port numbers should be available on your instance, then only you can allow. Now, usually what is happening, if you wanted to do this, you have to keep sharing RDP file or SSH file or maybe credentials with people who wanted to connect and access that particular instance. So to avoid that particular problem statement, Bastion is something providing you a kind of online solution. It's like a Citrix, right? Many of you might have seen or heard about Citrix. That is a kind of a virtual layer provided to you. With the help of it, you can, as a user, you can connect to customer network. You can connect and access customer services via using that particular Citrix environment, what we are like looking at it, right? So something similar to that. It's not a Citrix, but it's a kind of Bastion environment. So you don't have to explicitly share any RDP or SSH credentials or direct logins and other stuff with the customers. It's just that you provide Bastion credentials and they open up the URL into browser window, and then they just simply connect with the username and password, and then accordingly they will be able to access that particular instance. So that way Bastion host is something available. Firewall and DDoS network protection. So both of this fall into the category of security only again. So firewall is something definitely, I mean, by name you can make it out that you will get a kind of cloud managed security layer to protect your particular VNet and other isolated services behind the scenes. So in that case, you will be able to secure them. Whereas last but not least, in terms of DDoS network protection. So usually, like it is available as a part of Microsoft Defender, but here under this particular networking also, this particular feature is available. Now, when I enable this, there will be additional costing applicable for DDoS network protection as well. Okay, so it is always recommended that whenever we are planning to enable any of this particular mechanism, definitely we always need to check with the cost implications. That is there any cost involved? Is it the default feature or scenario available with it? And accordingly, we can plan and manage and secure our environment the way it is expected. So that's where we can have security options available. The next one is basically the IP address range. IP addresses, as I mentioned, that whenever we are planning with any particular virtual network provisioning and all. So one good thing is that nowadays, like Microsoft started one new warning message kind of notification in portal that okay, hey, if you go ahead with this 10.0.0/16, then this gets overlapped with DevOps VM VNet, for example, right? So if your intention is to connect two virtual network under the same region or across the region or across the subscription with each other, and if you are using the same IP address both the side, then definitely there will be a high chance that you will get IP conflict error in your particular networking. So if I say this, I have two VNet, VNet 1 and let's say VNet 2. If they both has same IP address range, then you will not be able to establish communication between both the virtual network. So that is something we need to keep in mind, that whenever we are planning to provide a particular networking scenario, then in that particular case, we need to identify or we need to visualize that how this networking options going to be work out, and then accordingly it will provide you a kind of options or communication in that particular space. So in that scenario, it has to be here. I can say, okay, 10.1.0.0/16, and this one is 10.0.0 /16. So that way, both the VNet can have unique IP address range and they are ready to connect with each other. So in case whenever we are planning to establish any communication between networking and all of that, we always need to check the IP range. Now, unless and until you do not provision any service inside the virtual network, you are free to change your IP range any point of given time. Okay. But as soon as you provision any services behind that network or subnet, then your IP range changes may not be applicable because the resources are already up and running inside that. And now if you try to change, then there will be a warning message that, or maybe even error message as well, that if you try to like attempt any changes to IP range and all, then you may lose connectivity with your resource, and first thing in place, it will not be applicable. So we have to make sure that whenever we are planning with our IP range creations and all that, we need to identify that what sort of IP address we wanted for our networking, and then accordingly we can design that particular networking solutions. So from the so right now I can consider that this is something like as a starting point, but if you are thinking about solutioning point of view, right? So network landing zone is basically starts from where we are planning to design and implement our cloud architecture or cloud infrastructures and other stuff. So network landing zone is one of the primary requirement. These are like many other stuff available as a part of you can say documentation. So I will take you through with those activities and maybe some good resources which may help you in your day-to-day work and other stuff as well, right? So as I mentioned, like zero trust model, right? So almost all environment services and other stuff follow the zero trust model, and you can have some topology and other scenarios to be followed in terms of networking point of view. So here, in case we are planning to work with any networking scenario, you will be able to get started with this landing zone creation. So landing zone is basically any idea, like if you have heard about landing zone, anyone? What do you think about landing zone? Any guess? So here, landing zone, I will generalize it. So definitely, I mean, here we can consider that when it comes to cloud point of view, landing zone is something you can say it's a kind of criteria which allows enterprises to define that what is the default like resource model we are planning to go ahead with it, right? So before hosting any services, before hosting any particular environment or applications or anything, we always look into the landing zone creation. So landing zone basically summarize with compute, you can say network, storage, DB, security, policy, RBAC, identity. There are backup, DR, HADR if I want to write, right? So all these particular consideration we can keep in mind, and then we come up with our landing zone to be created. So this landing zone is basically your framework, maybe I can say. It's your initial stage where you can decide that what sort of services, what sort of like activity we are planning to go for, and then accordingly you will have your particular resources and services to be managed underneath. Now, along with this, I can consider that my network landing zone is one of the criteria which basically helps me in terms of defining that overall solution. Simple example, I was giving that scenario of that restaurant chain migration, right? So, uh, during that particular process, we were facing one challenges on the networking front that customer had a 40 gate firewall on premise, and that was they were following for their security point of view and firewall point of view with 40 gate firewall. And when they started migrating their infrastructure from on-premise to Azure, so there are supposed to be landing zone created, including all these objective, plus networking was one of the primary problem statement that they are supposed to manage that in case any network traffic come from that 40 gate firewall, it has to go through that firewall and then it will go to the Azure network and all that stuff. So there were some issues like we were facing in terms of transferring data packets, it was not allowing and all that stuff. So here basically while going through with that, so we need to plan or we need to like design. So I mean, the later stage we found the issue with the landing zone only, the way it was designed, the way it was created for the traffic managing and all that. There was some fault in that case, and then we rectify that and resolve that again, redesign that particular structure and came up with the solution. But yeah, here we need to identify that whenever we are creating network, so network is your initial step where you design that how your services, resources looks like, how they're going to interact with each other, and then you will be able to create that whole network landing zone on top of it, and then accordingly you will be able to provision your resources and services. So here I will say your address space for your virtual network which you wanted to give. So for example, here I can say 10.1.0.0/16. So if you see that warning message also gone away. So I will get this unique IP range. Under that, we get this subnet. Now by default, available, you will get one default subnet available as a part of it. So here I can say, okay, I mean, this is something default one. I mean, the name is given as default. If you want to change, you can. There is no mandatory part that you keep it default. I can say, okay, web app subnet, right? And the IP range, whatever is given, I'm fine with that. Okay, and according to this, I mean, there are other options are also available. Does this subnet have netting gateway, network security group and all? I will talk about this part later. And if this subnet is getting connected to any particular platform services or not, right? Is there any delegation available connecting to any particular other services of this environment or not? So there are like multiple options are there. So here, I mean, if you want to give it, you can while creating subnet if you are well versed with those options. Otherwise, like right now, you can leave it as is. You have options to all do all these things later as well. So as of now, I'll say like yeah, save and simply if you want to add more number of subnet while creating this, you can, right? Or else probably even later also you can create it. So here, that's my particular IP address range. The tagging part, as I said, so tag is something basically applicable from the labeling point of view. Right now, I mean, you can imagine like very few resources got created into Azure. So it will be easy for all of us to manage with that ease, and you have very less resource, so you can simply manage and organize them. But yeah, when it goes to a higher like resource, I mean, the number of resource get increased, then it will become challenging for you to manage and organize those resources into the system, and then accordingly you may simply play around with those activity into the system what we are like looking at it. So ultimately like the goal over here is that we need to identify, or you can say we need to visualize a kind of option or kind of activity where, in case of planning and working with this particular enterprise grade environment, we have some of the options or we have some of the activity to be identified, and then accordingly you will be able to filter them, you will be able to search those resources, you can get the details about pricing, you can get this resource belongs to whom, and all that information you can have it in place. So that is something resource tagging. And last but not least is review and create. So whenever any resource we are planning to provision in Azure environment, the review and create is basically a validation stage, right? It will show you that what all the configuration you have done, you review once, and after that you can simply go ahead with creation of this particular service. So first, this review and create is a process of validation plus the review of configuration, okay? Why validation? Because sometimes like it may be possible that you are trying to provision something, but you do not have enough access, or there might be some particular clashes happening in your naming convention. There might be a quota limits you may have applied on your particular subscription. So those kind of warnings and validation errors you may get it during this particular stage itself. So it's not that you create, click on create, and after that you will get that, oh, this resource I cannot create because there is a cap applied, right? Or there is a policy applied. So in that case, this validation is basically give you all those clarity. And after that, you may simply click on create. So it will start creating your particular virtual network as in service. So this is something, one of the standard option available when it comes to creating and provisioning your virtual network, and it will give you a kind of VNet, subnet, and all those options to be available as a part of it. And you may simply create those particular networking scenario in terms of environment point of view. Yeah. So once we have this resource gets provision, so here we do have the like notification that okay, what's the current state of your resources, and you will get that once the resource get deployed, you can directly go to the resource, okay? Or else you can click on the resource group. This is your resource group. So here you will get to know that my VNet is the resource available. And under this particular my VNet, you have some of the options available in terms of networking point of view. So every service, okay? Every service, whatever we provision, it has a default overview tab. So this overview tab basically give you the summary about that service configuration, that it may have some default informations available, and this may vary from service to service. Okay. So if you are provisioning virtual machine, you may get different overview of VM. If it is an app service, if it is a SQL Server, Cosmos DB, any service which you get, you may get a different overview tab for your environment and for your services available. So whenever we are creating anything in place, we need to identify that what sort of configuration and modification we are expecting into it, and then accordingly we will be able to go ahead with that. So this is your some of the standard tabs. Along with this, we have some settings and all, right? So whatever I talked about, right, in terms of DDoS attack, firewall, and all that stuff, it's available after creation as well. In fact, more than that, features available in terms of configuring your virtual network. So in case anything we wanted to go beyond certain configuration after provisioning, we can do that. Right now, nothing is provisioned inside this. It is just a simple plain virtual network along with single subnet. Going forward in future, if we wanted to create anything, then we can have those additional options available where you can add more number of subnets and all of that, and accordingly we will be able to play around with those activity in place. So here uh, you can say you need to plan and manage what kind of IP range we do have, and it will help you out, or maybe you can say it will give you a kind of activity where you will get. So as I mentioned that, okay, when you go ahead with the subnet provisioning and all that, so what Microsoft is offering you, you will get 5 IP will gets reduced from this. So here I will be getting 256 IP range probably, but due to the Azure restrictions, I will be getting 251 IPs only. So why so? Why only 251 IP? So here what Microsoft says that uh, here Azure, so if you see over here, it's written 251 only. So 5 IP addresses of the subnet, that is something Microsoft use it. So the usage of those particular 5 IP addresses can be depend on the Microsoft this thing, like probably they might be assigned it to some particular dedicated environment, or probably it will help you out that kind of those services get associated to some other particular components as well. So what we need to do is that we need to identify that it may be like a reserve IP address you may have, it will be applied to some gateway. You may have some particular network broadcast address, you may have DNS IPs and all that. So usually Azure reserves the first and last address in each subnet for protocol and providing you some sort of service usage communications and all of that. So you will get generally 5 IPs, and this practice applicable in all cloud services, okay, not just only Azure. This practice will be applicable in AWS and Google Cloud as well, where they wanted to protect and secure some of the or provide some other service access also back into the system, and that way at least we will be able to manage. So the first one is like subnet creations and all. So here, since we do not have anything in this particular environment, here I can say, okay, oh yeah, I mean, this is something I see it has to be 8, and probably if you provide 8, then there will be a significant impact in your VNet and subnet, because it says that 8 is not a valid CIDR. It's like you have to use it something like this, where probably you can go ahead with 10.0.0 and then you go ahead with 8, because here you have given 1. So if you change it like that and then you go ahead with this, then there will be a change option, you need to take a look at it. So whenever you update this, okay, how many number of address you get it, how many number of IPs you get it, it will be listed over here. So if I save this and if I come back to my particular VNet and subnet, right? So right now there is nothing provision inside this. So if I come back to my particular subnet, then the IP range is irrelevant to this. So here you need to edit or you need to modify this particular IP range as well. right? And then accordingly, you will be able to plan and work with your IP addresses. Since there is nothing deployed, there is no impact to it. But if something is deployed inside that, then you have to make sure that whatever resources you have created inside that, there will be some impact on those services or resources, whatever we do have. So whenever you are planning or working with your VNet, subnet, IP range, and all that particular stuff, you need to make sure that whatever the IP range and other stuff you are creating and all of that, you have to define your IP ranges accordingly, and then probably you will be able to connect and access your resources back into the system what we are like looking at it. So VNet subnet basically allows you to create, configure, isolate, segregate your network infrastructure, and behind the scene you can put up whatever the services you wanted to go ahead with your environment.
Well, that was our expert, and thank you so much for staying with us till the end of the video. Now, all you have to do is just click the link in the description below, or if you are just starting out, just type k21academy.com/azure02. Now, all you have to do is just enter a name, enter email ID, enter phone number, and click on register now. And you will be redirected to this page. You can also add this to your Google Calendar or Apple Calendar, and I promise this is something that you don't want to miss. So go ahead, click on the link and step into the world where learning knows no boundaries. Till then, keep enjoying. I'll see you in the next video.